So I come to the end of the 6 Tudor Queens series. Now every time I make a video about something that I may have been putting off for a long time, something happens which makes the eventual release of the video quite apt. Here, for example, while I am reviewing a novel about Catherine Parr, in a month's time there will be a movie about Catherine Parr coming out. So while I am going to use this video to review Catherine Parr, The Sixth Wife by Alison Weir, as I have the past 5 6 Tudor Queens books, I will also be comparing it with Queen's Gambit by Elizabeth Fremantle, which is going to be renamed Firebrand when the movie comes out because, of course, Queen's Gambit is already the name of a Netflix series. It is interesting that while they are pretty much the same story, they're told from Catherine's perspective, and they pretty much end with her death from childbed fever, they are written in 2 different contexts, and could almost be considered different genres, even though they're both historical fiction. Alison Weir's novels have been carefully constructed, where every decision the character makes is based on something that actually happened, or something consistent with the characters she's created. And what's more, much like Philippa Gregory, she has built her own canon, continuity, something like that. So the characters and their decisions have to be consistent through each instalment. Whereas Queen's Gambit, although the first in a trilogy of novels set in the Tudor era, is pretty well self-contained on its own. The other 2 books are about Lady Jane Grey's sisters after she's been executed, and Penelope Devereux respectively. The Sixth Wife starts all the way back in 1517, when the sweating sickness comes to Catherine's family home and claims the life of her father. She and her siblings, William and Anne, move to Rye House with their relatives, while her mother, Maud Green, returns to court to serve Catherine of Aragon. We've already met Maud in this series because she appeared in the first book, where her death was made a huge plot point. And we know for a fact that Catherine's first 2 marriages missed out on a lot of the main events that happened at court. Instead, the events that happened down at court, like the King's Great Matter and the Reformation, are told to her second hand, while she is in Lincolnshire and Yorkshire. Due to the slow pacing and Weir's determination to pretty much cover everything that happens to Catherine even before she marries Henry, she doesn't end up marrying Henry until chapter 17, which is the halfway point of the novel, at least according to the paperback. Before then, we see Catherine marry her first husband, leave Rye House, and deal with her tyrannical father-in-law. There is pressure on the newlyweds to have children, but the only problem is Catherine's husband is gay. After they move to their own estate, they do manage to have more successful joinings. And Catherine does manage to get pregnant, but she miscarries. In the meantime, she meets the Askew family, including Anne, who is a child at the time, but not long after meeting her, Catherine gets a nightmare of the older version of Anne being burned at the stake. As I said, news about the King's Great Matter arrives in bits and pieces to Catherine, but due to the education she experienced when she grew up, and because of her open-minded tutor, she becomes open-minded to the idea of religious reform and gains a rapport with Anne Boleyn, even if they never meet. When Catherine marries her second husband, despite their age gap, they manage to get along really well together. But his lack of ambition means staying up in Yorkshire at Snape Castle, and it is here that she learns of Anne Boleyn's downfall. Her sister Anne Herbert, who has been at court the entire time, tells her sister discreetly in a letter that she thinks Anne was set up. And I should also state that throughout the novel there are so many Annes. I mean, Anne Boleyn, Anne Stanhope, Anne Herbert, Anne Askew, and when you're listening to it on audiobook, it can be a little tricky to tell which is which. The earliest point in which the 2 novels meet is the Pilgrimage of Grace. In The Sixth Wife, Catherine is the one who takes charge, defending her husband and protecting her stepdaughter Margaret when they're being held hostage. And I must state, although the 2 of them are threatened with the idea of sexual assault and it hangs over their heads until they are no longer hostages, it never happens. And after the Pilgrimage of Grace, the family decide to leave Yorkshire and go down to Buckinghamshire to stay at Stowe or Charterhouse in London. Or is it Charterhouse Square? One of the two. And Askew returns in chapter 11, where she approaches Catherine while in London, saying that she's left her husband and asks for Catherine's help. And Catherine refuses in fear of persecution by association. Though she is sympathetic to the Protestant cause, she doesn't really understand the idea of martyrdom. Like, what can really be achieved from giving your life when you can stay alive and make sure that your cause succeeds? She also gets to go to court, where she meets Catherine Howard shortly before her downfall. I don't think the conversation between Catherine and Catherine happened in the 5th book. Anyway, it would have been cool if it did, but it's been a while since I read that one. And then after her second husband dies and she falls in love with Thomas Seymour, Thomas asks her to sleep with him before she marries Henry. But Catherine decides not to, even though she really, really wants to, because she's planning several steps ahead already, and she just cannot afford a scandal at this point. Although Catherine and Henry do manage to sleep together, whatever enjoyment they get is ruined by the smell of his legs. And that is where I'll leave the summary of this just for now, because after this it kind of has to be compared directly with this. Now, the Queen's Gambit begins much later in Catherine's life. It is after the Pilgrimage of Grace, but on the day that her second husband dies. The context has changed a bit here, because Catherine has been shown tending her husband while he's dying. She has not been to court at all, and she hasn't met Thomas Seymour. In Queen's Gambit, Catherine is shown to be making elixirs from herbal remedies. The beginning is kind of in medias res, because in that beginning chapter, both Catherine and John Latimer are forced to remember the events of the Pilgrimage of Grace, where, in this one, while Catherine was being held hostage, she was indeed assaulted. And not only that, she was impregnated, but gave birth to a stillborn child. Unbeknownst to Catherine, Margaret was targeted by the same person, but she has sworn her maid, Dorothy Fountain, to secrecy. John thinks his pain prior to his death is punishment for letting that happen to his wife, and he asks Catherine for a stronger dose of this pain medication, let's call it, and it eases his passing, but it's something that makes Catherine feel guilty for the rest of the novel. Later on down the line, when Henry is dying, she considers giving Henry the same thing, but then she's too terrified of the idea that that will be traced back to her. In Queen's Gambit, Catherine shares the narrative, whereas in The Sixth Wife, it was just her. The other main character is Dorothy Fountain, or Dot as she is repeatedly referred to, and she gives a perspective of the life below stairs, being a servant, being a commoner, watching all of this religious stuff happen, and trying to make sense of it. Thomas Seymour enters pretty much very early on, and his attraction to Catherine is both from his looks and his very forward personality. And in a moment of weakness, while Dot and Margaret are watching from the bushes, Thomas and Catherine do it right there on a sundial. I'm trying to think of the physics of that, because sundials are kind of small sometimes. Either you fall off, or you get a metal thing poking you right in the back. This is the only gratification that Catherine is going to get for a while. When she marries Henry, during her wedding ceremony alone, her new clothes, from her hood to her shoes to her dress, they chafe because they're new and they haven't been broken in. And Henry, in this one, can't get it up without much effort. So for Catherine, it's awkward and unenjoyable, but she can't complain. The first big difference you'll see between the two novels is how they are told. The Sixth Wife is done in third-person narration, told in past tense and completely bound to Catherine's perspective. Meanwhile, Queen's Gambit is told in present tense, but still with third-person narration, a bit like Wolf Hall. But the perspectives can change. Catherine and Dot are the main narrators, but it also goes with John Latimer and Hewick and a few other people. Henry VIII himself is portrayed as a man who hides his true self. Weir's portrayal can be somewhat more threatening, because while yes, we know Henry VIII to break out in these incredible rages smacking everything, breaking things. No, I'm getting Ray Winston flashbacks. Here it shows him being calm, but he is still willing to do things like submit Anne Askew to torture, and of course he's executed 2 of his wives, and he sends Surrey to the block just before his death. But a lot of his more nefarious decisions appear to have been influenced by Gardner and the Seymours, who appear to be taking advantage of Henry's deteriorating state. Fremantle's Henry has a hair-trigger temper, but also a pitiful old man vibe, trying to capture the youth of his past, but people are just saying, "Oh, poor man, he's so old." In his first scene, Henry and a bunch of courtiers crash a party that's being attended primarily by women because it's a baptism. And of course he's doing that thing like he did with Catherine of Aragon and Anne of Cleves, where he shows up in a mask pretending to be just another player. And then he will take off his mask, reveal himself, and everyone will be like, "Oh, the king." And this is told from Catherine's perspective, but Catherine is tactful and tells Margaret, "Pretend to be surprised." And Margaret's like, "Why?" And then Henry invites Catherine to a friendly game of chess where he flirts, of course, saying, "I could make you my queen." He seems like a nice guy, but then an usher accidentally steps on his foot and he smacks the guy so damn hard he falls over. Catherine's close call with Henry is predictably a big moment in both novels. Queen's Gambit is written as a typical thriller plot, so this close call is stretched out through several chapters. Or, well, a lot of the book, anyway. It is what all the tension is built up to. But that is mainly because Queen's Gambit can afford to spend a lot of time on this plot point, because it only takes place over 5 years, whereas The Sixth Wife takes place over 31 years, and we're talking what would have been a blip to Catherine at the time, even though it would have been very, very scary. The Queen's Gambit also has a side plot where Dot is imprisoned by Gardner in Newgate Prison on suspicion of heresy, and she gives a fake name, so they don't know who she is. They don't know she serves the Queen, and she manages to escape. And the scene where, after Catherine has found the warrant, had a mental breakdown, and Henry comes to comfort her, could not be more different between novels. Brace yourself. You might want to sit down. You're probably already sitting down, unless you're watching this while standing on the bus. In The Sixth Wife, it happens pretty much as it did, where Henry shows up, comforts her and says that you just worry me sometimes, and I hope you're going to be alright. And then he leaves. But in Queen's Gambit, Henry arrives and he pretty much condescends to Catherine and verbally coerces her into being sexually submissive. I don't want to go into too much detail because, 1, YouTube guidelines, and 2, it's just not that fun to read. I mean, there's not much detail in it because sometimes less is more. Like, she's good at Fremantle's good at writing the less is more tension-wise. But yeah, I was like, did I really just listen to that? Because I was listening to this book on audiobook as well. I mean, I bought the hard copies so I could take notes. Yeah, and by the way, Catherine's close call, they got different dates in this. So Sixth Wife, it's in 1545, where it's before Anne Askew gets arrested and burnt at the stake. But by then, Catherine has appeased Henry, and she feels like, I can't save Anne Askew because I've repeatedly warned her to be cautious. She did not listen to me. She kept going, and I just can't help her. I can't risk angering Henry again. Meanwhile, in Queen's Gambit, it's in 1546, but it happens after Anne Askew's been burnt, and it's kind of, as a result, it's a fallout of it. They've got Anne Askew, now they're trying to find her supporters. But even though in the Queen's Gambit that scene happened between Henry and Catherine, it does make her victory over Gardner and the Catholics a little bit more earned. While in The Sixth Wife, Catherine's victory is almost inevitable because we know what's going to happen. But it's still consistent with the strong and determined woman that she was, and whom we have gotten to know after 300 pages. Usually when we see Catherine on film, she appeases Henry in the gardens 5 minutes before the guards show up and nearly arrest her. But in both novels, they have Catherine save herself the night before, but the guards show up anyway. And I always think that is very important, because that is Henry showing, don't risk my fury again. It's his way of showing control. In a Catherine Parr property, which features the events of her life post-Henry, this is a make or break decision. We'll start with Queen's Gambit this time, just so you know what might be coming in the film. They might change this. I can imagine they might. Or they might not feature it at all. Let me gather some strength. Thomas Seymour displays more red flags than we'd usually expect of him before Catherine is even married to Henry. While he is brash and very lusty, there is a moment where Henry has already put his sights on Catherine, and he is sending Thomas away to get rid of the competition, as it were. At this point, Catherine doesn't believe that Henry wants to marry her, so she says, oh, it'll be fine, you'll be gone for 2 years tops, and when you come back we can get married. Thomas has a bit of a Freudian slip where he reveals that he's more pissed off about losing any chances of advancement if he's sent away from court, rather than being able to marry Catherine. But then he kind of throws in his desire to marry Catherine at the end, saying, and he's going to enjoy you. So you kind of got to keep that in mind for when Catherine and Thomas are married. Like in Becoming Elizabeth, after Henry's death, Thomas and Catherine start sleeping together before they get married. Although, granted, not literally less than 12 hours after the king has died. Now, when it comes to Elizabeth, there are different perspectives of her from Dot and Catherine's point of view. To Catherine, she is intelligent and witty, and she fills the gap that's been left since Margaret died, because Margaret Neville, in truth, she did die. When did she die? At the end of the book there's like a list of dates and characters. 1545. Yes, she died in 1545. So yes, Catherine would have indeed wanted to fill that gap. She appreciates and encourages Elizabeth's accomplishments. But to Dot, she can see what Catherine can't, where Elizabeth is quite bratty. And she even stoops to the kick the puppy trope. Or in this case, it's Catherine's dog Rig. I remember when it came to that bit and I was just like, you're really trying to exaggerate this character to be horribly mean. And then when Lady Jane shows up and proves that she's quite accomplished as well, Elizabeth gets a bit jealous and is just like, no, I'm the smartest person in the room. And she is flirting. She is shown flirting with men, thinking, I can get the attention of any man in the room. She even gives a naughty wink to William Parr, Catherine's brother. When I was skimming through the last chapters, I was trying to find a scene, that scene where Thomas destroys Elizabeth's dress, because that's one of the most well-known moments from this time period. But I can't seem to find it. It might be in here, I might just be accidentally skipping over it. But if it's not here, then it feels as though they're trying to remove any sympathy from Elizabeth for when what happens. So these descriptions of Elizabeth's quote-unquote true nature culminate in Catherine coming in on Thomas and Elizabeth in bed together. And remember, Elizabeth is 14, Thomas is in his early 40s. Even if this was the 16th century, even though we have different standards now, there's a word for that. Okay? Because we've agreed, conventional society has agreed, that children cannot properly consent. And yet Elizabeth's feelings are just not addressed. She gets just as much of the blame for it in Dot's eyes as well as Thomas's. And I think this just ruins the whole tone of the novel. Considering it opened with Catherine and Margaret reflecting on what happened during the Pilgrimage of Grace, where they were also taken advantage of, there could have been some symmetry to it. But no. Now, I read The Sixth Wife not long after Queen's Gambit, and when it came to the post-Henry chapters, things were a little sketchy. And when you're listening to the audiobook while commuting between cities, and you get off the train just as it comes to the bit where there might be a hint that Thomas and Elizabeth have feelings for one another. I just wanted to scream in the middle of the train platform. Anyway, after Henry dies, Catherine and Thomas secretly pledge themselves to one another before witnesses, before they are secretly married in a religious ceremony. Only then do they sleep together at Greenwich Palace. The revelation of the marriage is so scandalous that Lady Mary storms out, thinking that Catherine has disrespected her father's memory. And once they are married, Thomas starts exhibiting toxic masculinity. He gets jealous of male servants who are alone with Catherine for too long, and Catherine has to repeatedly remind him that, as Dowager Queen, she kind of has more authority than him. And also, she prides herself that, as a Dowager Queen, she is the prize. Thomas is the one that is marrying her. Now, Cat Ashley repeatedly tells Catherine that Thomas is coming into Elizabeth's room and being inappropriate, and there is a slight hint of jealousy in Elizabeth's demeanour when Catherine comes along to make sure that there's nothing untoward going on. But they also include Elizabeth defending herself, saying, "I make sure that I'm up and dressed before he shows up because I don't like it." At the end of each of these novels, Addison Weir does put like an author's note talking about her creative process, but there's nothing about how she wrote Thomas and Elizabeth. Like, Catherine does give Elizabeth the benefit of the doubt because she thinks that because she is flooded with teenage hormones, she thinks that she might love Thomas, but Thomas is just being playful. I understand wanting to show a portrayal where Elizabeth does have confused feelings, because for some people, especially people like Elizabeth, who has lived with very little familial love in their life, they go looking for it somewhere else, and someone giving you all that attention the way Thomas did, she would be like, I'm not sure if I want it, I'm not sure if it's inappropriate, but it's there. But I don't know, I was also still recovering from becoming Elizabeth as well, so I just kind of always interpreted the Elizabeth Thomas scenario as she never wanted his advances, because she knew that, one, it would ruin her prospects of marriage, and also probably just wasn't attracted to Thomas Seymour. But the problem was she couldn't really tell Catherine about it because she was worried that she would be sent away from Catherine, whom she considered her mother. And Elizabeth does reveal that Thomas attempted to propose to both her and Mary before he eventually proposed to Catherine. And that kind of shatters Catherine's faith in Thomas. This does include the scene where Thomas slices up Elizabeth's dress because it's her mourning dress and he is sick of seeing her wearing it. He tries to assert dominance once again, and Catherine only holds her just to keep her safe. And it's Thomas's insecurity that quite possibly costs Catherine her life, because after she gives birth, she's bleeding more than usual and she's starting to develop her childbed fever, and she begs Thomas to send for a doctor rather than the midwife. But he refuses because he doesn't want another man looking at her. So yeah, I think Thomas was definitely much more of a bad guy in this than he was in Queen's Gambit. I mean, he was still a douche. I will always have fun disparaging Thomas Seymour. Both Catherines are pretty similar to one another and very well resemble her real-life counterpart. And because of this, I do feel a bit more optimistic about the portrayal we're going to get in Firebrand, as opposed to what we got in Becoming Elizabeth. Like, my God! I'm sorry, look how they massacred my queen. The only big difference is that Fremantle's Catherine is more willing to give in to her emotions. But you've got to understand that the novels are appealing to different audiences here. Queen's Gambit definitely appeals to people who enjoy the Tudors or Game of Thrones and come into this kind of story expecting sex scenes and violence and a bit more backstabbing than there actually was. While The Sixth Wife is more for the Elizabeth R and I Claudius crowd. They came for the history, they're staying for the history, and they want to see how things are being played out from different perspectives. Catherine Parr was a long-suffering woman who repeatedly put the needs of others before her own. She exercised great patience as to how she approached life and planned several steps ahead in order to stay alive. Her pride was not too stubborn to pretend to submit, while her true feelings were just under the surface. And sadly, because she claimed almost nothing for herself, she was prone to be taken advantage of by Henry, by Thomas, even Anne Stanhope. In both novels, there is quite a bit discussion about Anne Stanhope coming in and claiming the Queen's jewels before Catherine has a chance to separate her own personal jewellery from it. And having seen a lot of Tudor dramas, every time a real life person shows up, I tend to draw from their on-screen counterparts. Usually it differs depending on what kind of novel you're reading. In both cases, for these novels, I imagined Jolie Richardson from the Tudors, because I see her as the definitive Catherine Parr. Catherine's portrayals weren't a problem in the novels. In fact, I kind of enjoyed both of them up until we got to the Elizabeth Thomas scenario. But I also know that however consensual it was between Elizabeth and Thomas, it still meant that Catherine was never going to get her happy ending. I hate having to reach that conclusion every single time, but there's no escaping it. Overall, I would say The Sixth Wife is a superior novel purely because it spans a longer amount of time and takes fewer liberties. I would like to see the events of the Six Tudor Queens series adapted into a TV series or something where the events of each book overlaps with each other, because we sometimes have scenes from different perspectives. More than anything, I want a Catherine Parr portrayal that features her life before Henry as well as after Henry, because she can take on the view of how the decisions made by Henry VIII and the Privy Council affect the rest of the country. You could easily make it into just 2 seasons, or you could have something like The Crown where there's time jumps between each season. The Sixth Wife is intended to be as factual as possible, while Elizabeth Fremantle admits in the author's notes that Queen's Gambit was first and foremost meant to be fictional. And that isn't really a crime. It's fun to read historical fiction. I just really hope that Firebrand is good, or at least tolerable. I really don't want to repeat a Becoming Elizabeth where the costumes and the sets look amazing, but the story is just trash. And that was me finally finishing Six Tudor Queens by Alison Weir. I know there are spin-offs to the series. There's an Elizabeth of York one, there's a one told entirely by Henry VIII's perspective. I'm not really interested in Henry VIII's perspective, honestly. Now I've done that, when I reach the next subscriber special, it's going to be the Wolf Hall trilogy. I've already listened to Wolf Hall and the second one, Bring Up the Bodies, and I'm yet to listen to The Mirror and the Light, but I will do that after I finish the book I'm on. I tend to listen to these on audiobook because I really do struggle with big books. Oh yes, I should add very quickly that Firebrand is coming out on the 21st of June. I'm not going to be seeing it on the 21st of June. I will probably be seeing it the following week or something like that, and the review of it may come out in early July as opposed to June. Plus, I don't like to jump straight into a review of something after I've watched it. I did that with the Anne Boleyn 2021 series. And that one was so bad. And I'm not really a fan of that review because I was so angry. I don't like being angry. I call it my inner Brummy. I don't like it when my inner Brummy comes out. It gives me a headache. That was a 7K special. If you'd enjoyed that, make sure you like and subscribe and leave a comment. Make sure that whole thing gets shared around on the algorithm. And also, thank you to my patrons who support me in all that I do. You can see their names on the screen right here. And also, the highest level contributors, my King and Queen patrons, get a shout out. Thank you so much. Alison Cuff, Anna from Gustine, Annalise Barnett, Jill My Nero, Larissa and Leslie Williams. Thanks a lot. And I will see you next time.